Do you know the best way to start a studio project? I remember when I first started an architecture project, I was handed a project brief. I tore a piece of trace paper, picked up a pen to start writing and drawing, and nothing was coming. Maybe you've had this experience recently. Maybe you're curious about other ways to start a project. Your process has gone stale. Or maybe you're just struggling with your professor's process.
So, this episode is all about designing differently and just being open minded to other designers' process because we ultimately think it'll improve how you approach your own projects and just have a well rounded approach on architecture and design in general. So, in this episode specifically, we're going to break down our own professor's design process and tell you how we found our own unique voice and our own unique design process and ways of thinking about architecture. So, stick with us to the end of the episode because hopefully we'll inspire you to create your own little Frankenstein monster of a design process. So, open up Enscape, grab an iced coffee, and let's get into it. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to another episode of the Curtain Room Podcast, everyone. I am your host, Ryan, with my co-host,
Albert, just Albert.
And joining us today is the one and only Sully.
Wow, 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 wow.
Let's go.
Air horn
New
sound effects.
season.
Applause. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me back, guys.
Yeah. You might recognize his beautiful voice from our previous season, but now we got that exclusive face reveal on the Curtain Podcast today, so you got to tune in.
And for future times, if you want me to have a paper bag over my head, let us know. Let us know. Just make sure.
Yeah, we'll get our 3 paper bags ready to go for next episode.
The paper bag pod.
I guess in this episode, we're really just exploring like how other people design. Like in this specific episode, we're leaning into how our professors' methods of design influenced how like we design today. Like what our biggest takeaways are after like a deep dive into what we've learned as we've gone through our semesters and just how that's gotten us to where we are today.
So why are we doing this? What? Right? Like
So this episode is so super important because one, it's really important to take a new methods of process because your way is definitely, not the only way to design. And so with more information, we get more knowledge, and our main takeaway now is to embrace the professor's workflow. And so how do they start their own projects? So
There's a lot of times where I think it kind of just discounts some things sometimes. Like maybe some of their process looks a little funky to you. I remember definitely there were many times where I'm like, our projects, this is architecture school and a whole bunch of other things. So being open-minded, just trying things out, and who knows what comes out at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
We can start by jumping into
our first
super secret guest or super secret character. We're calling him Professor Mies 2.0. We say this, and again, if you know from K-State. Really, it's like a lot of the solid principles that we've learned about in our architecture history class. It's the whole tried and true form follows function. And it's really great because it handles all the simple parts of what a building has to in order to become like a proper building. If you're doing only form, you're getting like Frank Gehry type of projects where there's a bunch of wasted space, you're throwing money into things that don't need to have money thrown into them, and ultimately you sacrifice a lot of the functionality that people want. But if you focus too much on that, then you can sometimes lack some of the other things. So it's a little bit of combination of both, but ultimately this professor, especially for like my second year when I was taking that class or studio, it was really important for me to just know how to make decisions right away and like just be very decisive with the things that I'm putting in the building have very specific purpose. So then some of that too is learning, like there's a bit of research with it, but rather than doing research like we'll get into later in the episode, it was a lot more focused on researching the client, researching the people who are occupying the building and seeing what are the things that they need this building for. Like in the project we were doing is a farm incubator project. It's dealing with a lot of machinery. There's going to be some types of presentations. They need a huge like working garage to work on these agriculture machines. They need smaller lab-like studios so they can build the smaller machinery pieces and everything. And ultimately, it was just a functional building and
Mm.
more like an industrial building. So it worked really well in that time. I remember at least with that process, coming up with a lot of those diagrams and everything, even at the time, it was very much a diagram based off of like, how does this building function? And I don't know if maybe we can throw a little screenshot of the diagram that I've drawn for it. But it's a very simple progressive diagram where it's like you have the small studios that build the like research and builds the like smaller pieces of machinery that then go into a larger space where they assemble all those individual pieces into a bigger machine. And then that goes outwards of the building into the actual fields where they can run tests on it. And then you
Mm.
can immediately bring it back the other way with a reverse arrow that says, okay, we need to edit this part of the machine because it's not working too well.
Mhm.
Bring it all the way back, take it part of the pieces, put it back in design studios, research
Mhm.
ways to fix it, and then that process just keeps going back and forth. So ultimately, it was a really good building. It served its functions. It was beautiful to say the least because it's just like very simple, very like, Miesian, as
Mhm.
our Miesi 2.0 would put it. It was a great way to make a good building. I think that's ultimately a great way to summarize that professor's.
I have a question for you though, because I don't think Sully and I had Professor Mies 2.0, right?
We did not.
So my question would be like, what do you think something that Professor Mies 2.0 didn't really get into that, like, that made it so much better or worse or whatever? What are the
Mhm.
things that are the pros and cons, really?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like what I was just saying of like it's a great way to make a good building. There's a phrase that we've said at our university a few times, like Silly and Albert both know this, but it's like architecture with a capital A versus lowercase a. And really that
Mhm.
just goes more into going beyond just the general scope of a typical building. And like typical meaning what that is. Like it's there. It does its thing, it does it well, but it's nothing special. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's part of what was missing from the Professor Mies 2.0 process was didn't really do that like extra step of figuring out what else can this building do beyond the function.
Mm-hmm.
Take away the form, take away the function. What else is there left in this project that you can speak to? Does it give you any special emotions when you're walking inside? Does it like we never really looked at our projects from that perspective? And to their credit, it's second year. You're not necessarily thinking that deep into architecture quite yet, but you're still trying to figure out the basics. So again, when I had that professor, I think it was really helpful for me to funnel my ideas, kick out the ones that don't need to be there because like form follows function. If it's not forming a function or if it's not serving a purpose, why is it there? You don't need it. Let's clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
As someone that didn't have him for studio and seeing it from afar, I admired how he, and you can speak a little bit about this, Ryan, but admired how he would go about teaching you guys the little things in the architecture, the practical aspects. So and this may come from this
Yes.
person's background as being as well as running their own firm on the side as well being a professor. But I feel like as a second year or someone that's just starting architecture, you don't really talk about the details. And so I feel like that's a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
his process and thinking at that level helps your process even more or gets you thinking in different ways about the architecture. It helps inform you. It seemed like that was really
Yeah.
crucial.
See, this is why we have Sully on
Mm-hmm.
here. He gets the next parts of the questions going.
I wish I
That's
had.
like no, actually, that's a really really good point. I was about to completely forget about that until you brought
Yeah.
that up. But no, like there was a really solid part in that studio where we learned deeply about how things are put together. We learned about what reveals meant in architecture. When you're talking to contractors,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately when you're building this project, right? Everything that you design, you have to draw the details of how that thing gets put together. Otherwise, the contractor is just going to do what they think looks best. Well, ultimately, it doesn't usually look the best, which is why architects want to typically design how it's put together so they can be like, here, make it like this, please. So it looks nicer.
Yeah.
So then you get to notice all those moments of like those finite decisions. And you get to do that a lot more when you strip away the buildings down to their like basic components. So you can hone in on those details and figure out like, okay, we have a very like solid building. How does that corner meet the other corner? What materials do
Mm-hmm.
you have to put to make sure that they don't weather on themselves in a wrong way? Or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, even so, like again, him being in a profession, like teaching studio every other day, actually going to his office on the other days, he just had that like very practical nature to him that really helps set me up for that great perspective, and other people in my studio too, to look at architecture from that certain, like, this building has to become a building. How do we do all those things? What are those levels of detail that we have to reach?
Mhm.
Yeah, this is why I got silly on.
Even without taking his class, he understood the class.
But he understood the assignment without being there.
Believe me, you seem like a really good professor to have. I think that would have been a really critical. A lot of the students that were in his studio had that edge. It seemed like
Mhm.
you were thinking at it at that level, and I appreciate those perspectives,
Yeah.
especially when I got critiqued from him as well as people that took his studio.
How about you, Sully?
Yeah.
Who did we have?
Who do we have?
Well, we all had Professor Hot Dog. We could talk about that real
We
quick.
did have. That's how we met.
Professor Hot
First time
Dog.
we met.
I was like,
First time we met.
who is that?
Yeah, Professor Hot Dog. For the reason hot dog's a weird thing without us giving context, but he had a lot of sayings, and this was just, he had asides, and I appreciated that from the man. One of them specifically was the idea of, you know what's in a hot dog? And this was the first day of
Every
studio.
single class.
First day of studio.
Every single class, he would say that.
And we're just like, huh? What? I mean, I've never thought about it really.
What does this have
I mean,
to do with architecture?
yeah. No, I think a lot of his process came from the looking at singular moments in a experiential sense. One thing we did that I would highlight was charcoal rendering, specifically for our section project. We had to do them on the side. He also had us do a lot of sketching competitions. There's a sticker method we could get into. It almost became a competition for
stickers.
us to show the stickers. I'll just do it. All of us came in every studio with a new drawing that would typically
he would give us homework at the end of every studio, basically, and like draw something.
Yeah, and then we'd pin it up on the crit room, beautiful place, as we all know. And we were given stickers, green or red. Was it? I think it was, or was it just green?
It was like really.
Nobody.
Yeah,
there was like
the most fluorescent colors possible.
We didn't bag anyone. I don't think there was red ones. I think it was just green. But people that got the most stickers got praise essentially, and talked about why it was good, and definitely fueled some of us to try as hard as we could to get stickers.
Yeah,
it was fun.
He made it competitive almost, where it's like like everyone had to present what their drawing would look like, and so because of the competitiveness of the nature of it, everyone was striving to do something that they
evolve
do
every
before,
single
so, like,
studio. It seemed,
yeah,
like it pushes people
be able
to
to draw
do better.
It also had us talk to the people that had a lot of stickers and be like, hey, what were you doing specifically that, like, how'd you do that technique? Like, how do you draw so well? Like, do you have any advice for me? Like, I think there's a lot of it was competitive, but also healthy in a sense. I think that really was a strong factor of that.
I remember him standing in front of the class, and he just like he does this thing where he's just like looking over the stuff. He stops and he's just like, and then just looks.
Just like the hard point at the wall. Who's RD? And then they had to stand up and be like, all right, I did this because I really liked the look of this building and I liked the shadow.
The shadow was
Point
shadowing.
at another one. Who's SW?
The shadow really
no, it's fine. But
right
I think
now.
ultimately, shadow be shadowing. No, but he did talk a lot about like the importance of light and just like what you were talking about earlier, Sully, like the whole like experience part, like the fact that without light, architecture loses so much power of it. Like you need light to experience the space in a particular way. And I think this kind of went all over our head when we were there in the process as second year brain studio mates. But it was just like his points that he was talking about, they really were hitting on some great things, like the story building and the narrative behind projects, and thinking back to like precedents, like look back in history, find the great architects, and what are they doing? What did they do in this space? How did they bring the light in? How did they craft this space to make it feel the way it does? And then being able to graphically, like what Sully's saying, like just draw that every day or every studio period made you realize what they're doing from a different perspective. It wasn't research on like Arc Daily. It was drawing it as research, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Yeah. No, something that I also took away from him was he always had a question about who is the person you're standing on top of, like
Mm.
who's the architect that what it's kind of like
Which
the
Pritzker Prize architect are you leaning on a little bit? I
Mm-hmm.
think
yeah, yeah.
The Pritzker folks.
first time I actually heard about that award. So lean on it heavy
What is
now.
the Pritzker Award?
Well, yeah, for people that don't know, it's a very select group of people, architects specifically, that are, it's essentially the highest praise that you can get as an architect.
Hmm.
It's a legacy
So yeah, and so
award.
in science there's like this thing called the Nobel Peace Prize,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
but within the architectural world, that award is called the Pritzker Award,
Which is weird because then
and so.
the
So if
in
you
like
got one of
journalism
those, you
and
know what you're
writing,
doing.
is it Pulitzer?
Mhm.
That
If
sounds
you,
about
I
right.
think that's the arts and English one. I've never really thought about that. They're very similar names, but yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
he was
There's like,
definitely he was one of the first people to be like, and this is something I've always had a problem with, the idea that nothing, you can't create anything completely new. You should lean onto the greats and understand what they do well in order to make your own
mm,
stuff.
dude, but I feel like as a second year though, you just kind of want to do things on
Ego
your
driven.
own.
You're like,
Like you
no, I'm
don't
gonna be the
necessarily.
best architect of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then well, it's also because you lack the knowledge, and so like you're trying to like invent new ways of seeing things, and so until like that professor, that upperclassman that comes in and says, hey, this kind of looks like this, maybe you should do research on this person.
Mhm.
And then I think that's what's so important about it too, is that as a second year you really need to look at precedents, because the problems that you've arrived at, somebody probably already had the solution,
Yeah.
and so it's important to look at what their solution looks like.
So how would we summarize this, Professor, before the next one?
I'll say like a short phrase, maybe this will summarize it, but a short phrase I remember and still remember a lot about with him was the idea that light can't happen without shadow. Like you can't,
Mm.
the idea that of white space versus the concept of void and light is a very complex one, and it was something that he really liked to share with us as young students. And while a lot of it can be really complex, Louis Kahn has some writings that water over my smooth brain, even still reading them now. But the idea that simple idea that moments stand out when you have others that work in the background. So
Hmm.
whether you could take that at any scale you want to, but that was one of those things that just stays in my head and I
Hmm.
continue to think about when you design.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say the good parts and the bad parts of his design process that you
I was
took
just
away
gonna say,
from?
like, to put it more on like a process standpoint to like match the topic a little bit better. I think is just his way of studying precedents, not from, like I was saying earlier, like not from an Arc Daily perspective of like writing the facts of the building and the concept and whatever, but truly like analyzing it by drawing it yourself and being able to look at moments,
Hmm.
read the articles that go more into like the thoughts behind their moves in their buildings, and being able to take that and trying to apply it to your own building. That's more of the process that I got from it. So,
Hmm.
like in your early stages, finding good projects to base yours off of is that process part that I took away
Hmm.
a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the main takeaway from me was that the reason why he had us draw those specific things was because there is there is the experiential thing that you see through light and shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you draw these things, there is an emotional weight to it that moves people. And so he really wanted to experience, right? It's like the showing, not telling. And
Yeah.
so he really wanted to focus on that.
So in your own projects, like jump into Enscape if you don't feel confident with your drawing abilities, or really try to build those skills. If you're designing a space, don't really know what it looks like, try to draw it. Do the charcoal renders, see what
Yeah.
happens. So yeah, with those professors, I think they really help set up like our mindset in terms of figuring out our process. I think we could maybe think of a couple professors that are a lot more like process based. Like I have one specifically I can think of. I'm sure we all had the same one, but I think you guys have another one you guys had that I didn't. So I'm curious to hear what you guys had to.
Solinad had Professor Galaxy Brain, but his process is something that I personally didn't really get into it, or like I kind of rejected his process because ultimately it didn't work for me, but I understood where he was coming from.
Mhm.
I don't know how you felt about that, Sully.
I felt like I had to just I got lucky. Like his how he was thinking about it, we can elaborate a bit, but I his preface was shapes and how shapes and
Hmm.
their relationships ultimately can create a form, a plan, a
Hmm.
form, and an assembly of buildings.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah. So how did we start that? Like how what was the process like?
yeah, what I remember is that he started with make a bunch of shape formations, whether that was squares, circles. You had to have
Hmm.
intentionality though. So he was like, you can't just be willy-nilly with it. You had to, that arrangement had to have some form of rule or set of rules that
Yeah.
drove your thought process. In
Yeah.
reality, I was lucky, I feel like. We had rules. We made like a set of six. I think each page was a
Yeah.
set of six of those shapes. And
Yeah.
one was like he really liked where I was going. And I was 75% sure I knew what I was doing in that in that instance. But it did become my building. So
Yeah.
like yeah.
Something that I took away from the first part of this process was the parts to whole relationship,
Yes.
where you look at the tiny stuff which make up what makes the big picture.
Hmm.
And so the shapes, the tiny little shapes, squares, circles, or triangles that you're working with, how in how a configuration of them could then become a bigger thing. And so mine were like what I started out with squares, which then configured itself into this courtyard formation, which was the whole picture. And so what he was trying to get me to do was okay, how much can this parts whole figure how much can we push it to the point where it still reads as a courtyard,
Hmm.
right? That was what mine was.
Mm.
And so there was a lot of iterations after iterations from that just that 2D drawing.
Hmm. I think, and to be sure with mine, it was the idea of corners touching on forms, and then really thought about
I remember
how,
that project.
yeah,
The
not
big
my
no
best,
no.
yeah, the big no-no of architecture, corners touching corners. Yeah, that was, but it made me think about even more so like you, Albert. It was the idea of the space around those squares, those shapes. What does that become? I remember
Hmm.
specifically when I was trying to figure out my plan and I was so hyper focused on what's going on with the blocks itself. When I finally talked with the Professor Galaxy Brain, he was like, "Well, think about what can go on in the in between. Like this ends up being your lobby. Like that. There's your entry sequence where the spaces open up." I'm like, "Wait a minute.
Hmm.
Well, there we go. I don't feel screwed anymore. Like this is those were the intermediate. That's the circulation. That was the intermediating space between all the
Hmm.
important stuff. Or it, yeah, it's definitely something that maybe keep thinking about how those forms interact, not just directly, but what happens around it.
Hmm. And so we moved into 3D forms,
Hmm.
which then kind of like each 3D form, from my understood, was that each 3D form kind of had a different story or narrative that they were associated to, which then could lead to a different type of project. And so you would have to like iterate after iterate from each 3D form that comes from the 2D form, and see what the story could become based on that. That's how I understood my process from there.
My idea didn't translate well in section straight up. It was a plan driven idea. Like you can't like touch corners weirdly, like in the vertical direction. So yeah, it was once we started figuring out forms, it had to become how does that story translate? And the professor wasn't necessarily never narrative driven in a sense. It was a lot
Mhm.
more of that the process of really sticking to the geometry. And so
Mhm.
while we had professors that more delve into the experience, it's
Mhm.
I feel like that might be one of the reasons you didn't not reject it, but it's just clashed with you, Albert. I feel like,
Mhm.
right? Because you're very experience driven and wasn't really getting
Mhm.
to, sorry, Professor Galaxy Brain. You can cut that. Professor Galaxy Brain wasn't really matching with that. But he also another thing I appreciate about him is he hence the name knew everything. Like you
Yeah.
want to start something, he would go with you and have a discussion. And at some point
Yeah.
you're like,
Mans was
I'm
cursed with
learning,
knowledge.
I thought I knew this. I'm learning more about it thanks to him.
Mhm.
So a lot of
Yeah.
information. I felt smarter
Yeah.
after it.
But yeah, for sure. I guess that's like the main takeaways that we got from or
Yeah.
Professor Galaxy Brain. Messed up too.
Sorry, I'm gonna
But
start a
yeah,
Yeah.
starting a virus.
that's what we got from
Yeah.
Professor Galaxy Brain.
I was going to say, on that note of, or a slimmer note of initially rejecting or like clashing with another professor's process and ultimately finding the beauty in it. We all had this professor. Professor
Hmm.
hits different.
Mm,
Because I had this professor, I think it was either immediately or one semester in between. And then I had this professor. But it went from Professor Mies 2.0 ways of thinking into Professor Hits different ways of thinking, which are almost complete opposites, which is
mm,
why it clashed so hard with me at the beginning, because I was trained up to that point to think, again, like very just form follows function. Like everything needs to be very efficient. Everything has to follow a very efficient process to get there. So you're not wasting people's time. Again, with Professor Mies 2.0 running a business, he has that type of perspective on the design process and everything. Like be quick, be efficient, don't waste people's money. So when we got to Professor Hits Different, and almost like the first week, we're like, let's go do some art projects. I'm like, what? No. Why are we spending 2 weeks of our project, of a 4 week project, doing artwork? Like, how does that make any sense? Like, how are we going to make a building out of this thing? So I was like, not that I was against wanting to learn it, but I was just like, this is like such a bad way to do this. Like, we were wasting so much time. Like, how are we thinking about it from that perspective? But then once I started to just indulge in that process and really figuring out, there are some similarities still. Like we still started with researching the community behind this project, researching the type of things that they need, the history of the place that we're building this project in. And ultimately, all that research then funneled into a different point of the timeline of that design process sequence, where it's instead of immediately going into form creation, it's now pause that for a second. Let's do some artwork, and maybe that will give us a different way of thinking. But you guys can talk about that too.
Yeah, well, we started with the 2D artistic expression and Professor Hit's difference class. And so to me, I never really did that either. But I did like something we had in common was that the research part where we had to look into what the building is like, what the people are using are like. But then I never took it the next step of what does that emotion feel like? What does that experience feel like? And so she made me do it. And I was like, oh my, this is what I've been missing this whole time. And then
Hey,
from
it's different.
there, move yeah, it just hit different from there. And so moving into the 3D sculpture piece, I was like, oh, this is the story. This is how everything comes together
hmm.
artistically and also programmatically. And so that's when it like everything just hit like right there.
It's
It
different.
was just it clicked.
Yeah.
It just hit different.
Yeah. I ran it like I ran it like I love art. I love finger I like finger painting. I just give me some paints, let me work. But what I took a lot from it is the idea
Let
of
him
how
cook. Let him cook.
I took it like yeah, I'd be like Ryan later on, I'd be like, why did we spend all that time doing the art? Now I'm so behind.
Now I'm stressed.
No, oh my gosh. But what I really loved about that class is how a lot of things are going on in your head about the project and the context of the project, the user, the subject matter, the site, all that stuff. And the art allowed us, maybe even me specifically, just to synthesize that into a singular concept and idea. And that's
Mhm.
where
Yeah,
I took
no, that's
away
a
from
big
it.
point.
Yeah. Like take the first project we did with her was a jazz club, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of things that factor into the idea of the history of jazz. We listened to some music and translated that into a piece of art. We also had to think
The
about
2D
jazz as
one first.
yes, that was the
Mhm.
first one. The second one we did that was 2D was jazz in general. What do we think it is? How does that look visually? And then we
Mhm.
made models that were again very similar, but had to imply an idea of space. So
Mhm.
there was a lot there that I took away from it. The idea that jazz is a conversation. That's I got to this idea that it's not just a conversation between the members of the ensemble. It's also between the performer and the audience. And
Mhm.
Hmm.
Professor really liked that, really liked that, and it
Mhm.
became a really fun building to do at the end of it. Very similar. Albert had a really good concept for his the museum that we ended up doing, which
Yeah.
made some people
It
cry.
was it I made my
Sure,
it made
he
me
made
cry.
him he made many people cry.
But yeah, that was like I love Professor Hit's different. It's just her process was just what made me go from one level to the next because it was like I said, it was that's that tiny thing that changed from level 1 to like level 5 because of that singular art piece, and then turned into 3D art piece, which then turned into an architecture building.
Hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say, like wrapping a lot of that up is introducing that art part also really opened up a whole new avenue of how I thought about architecture from Professor Hit's different. Because again, like from that Misesian type of perspective of form and function, Professor Hitstiffer introduced this aspect of emotions. What is that emotion that you're going to get in this project? And that's why all the like research, the art pieces, because the art pieces are the things that help you discover what those emotions are in the research that you did. And then
Mhm.
taking that, being able to translate those art pieces into an architectural concept. We had a thing all the time in that studio too, where we would come up with our 3 sentences to describe our concept. That also is something that I use to this day with all of my design work, all the other semesters after that, which I'm sure you guys agree with as well. But
Mhm.
it overall, I think Professor Hits Different did a great job at combining a lot of aspects of the design process and funneling them into something that creates a really bomb project.
Mm.
Just it
Mhm.
hits on that functionality part because now you're in higher year, you understand all these things already, but you don't have to really spend time going into why you can't put a restroom next to a kitchen. It's now like you just understand that now. So let's get into the parts that push it even more.
Yeah,
And I think her
Mhm.
process really helps you do that type of thing.
I will.
Mhm.
I
So
will. I
with
will
that, I
say.
think we can. Oh yeah, yeah. No, no.
I
Let's
mean, I
do
will
it.
say we don't need to go into it too deep because I don't know if it's going to cause too many traumatic episodes. But the idea, one of her thought process ideas was getting rid of the computer, which
Oh yeah.
doesn't really.
Hmm.
It's. I wish I could be a lot better personally about physical like modeling, not just
Bro,
to
it's so
create it.
expensive though.
It is the idea of like modeling physically to like further your design rather than just creating an after product. Yeah, can't do that.
Hmm.
Nope. I need the computer. I need Rhino. I need Rhino. I need it.
No, that was definitely a
Yeah.
struggle at that time, especially when we're already limited on the timeline because you spend a lot of that dedicated to artwork, which again, it helps, but it also takes a lot of time to do those things. Every single time we do an iteration, it takes more studio days off of actually producing our project. So,
Mhm.
But I wanted to
no,
add
that's
that
a good
in.
point.
It's not all
Like not
sun. It
having a
wasn't all
computer.
sunshine and rainbows that semester.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that art, yeah, the beginning part, generally creating a concept was amazing, and I still use it to this day. I'd say that's
Yeah.
one of the biggest things I keep.
To the next professor.
Next professor.
Sully and I had this professor. Call him Professor Seinfeld.
Mm.
But what do you think his big takeaways were from his like? I guess what type of like design would this be like? Because I don't think mm, it's very much like the mindset too. Very similar to the mindset
It's a mindset.
process.
It's a mindset thing. There's the aspect of asking questions. I think was really hit by him, whether that was during critiques where he would come in and be like, "I'm not going to say anything. You guys say things to me. Like, you got questions, I can answer them, but get it.
Mm.
I'll get as much for you as you put into it. You know."
Mhm.
And especially once you start getting older, you have to realize that sense of independence. Like you can't just lean on a professor the whole time. And we're talking about this, but he almost freed us in a sense to that we're maturing as designers. We understand that we know a bit. We just have to ask questions, be upfront
Mhm.
Trust it
about
a
those
little bit
things.
more.
Trust it. Yes. Another thing I would say is he definitely is research based. He wants you to have a grounds in something. And the other thing as well is he wanted you to take your concept and manifest that throughout the entire project. So
Mhm.
your details,
Not just the building level, but the details.
your
Yeah.
interior elevations have to reflect what you thought about at the beginning. And that is very interesting because it talks about this idea of consistency, just making sure your project is
Mhm.
sealed tight, watertight, no leaks.
Yeah.
And ultimately that creates a really cool project.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, with all the questions, you kind of had to find answers, which the answers
Hmm.
had to have, you know, they had to be cited.
Hmm.
Because what makes a project super strong is that you have evidence that says this is why it works. And so that question answer citation aspect of the process was just super, you know, it made the project move to the next level because what can the jury say if you have the evidence to back it up? Like
Hmm.
they can't say anything bad about it.
Yeah.
Mm. And I wasn't in that studio, but I recognized that they didn't necessarily do the artwork like Professor Hit's different, but they definitely push you guys to experiment with different visual expressions of your project. Like I remember you
Mm.
guys were working on section drawings first, which was like the first time I've ever heard that type of a
Mm.
process of because usually people start with like either amassing diagrams or do like floor plan layouts first or something. But then when you guys jump straight into the section, most people are like, wait, I got to figure out the first floor before I jump to the other floors above it.
Yeah. I completely forgot about that. Yeah, I
I
forgot that we had
think,
to print those giant
dude,
sections and pin them up. But that
yeah, they were like 8 feet
accelerated.
long.
That accelerated it a lot. That problem with me is I do a lot of plan design and I just will keep working a plan and working a plan and working a plan. But to start with a section really opened my eyes to a lot of things are solved in that way, like a different way of designing. And
Dude.
we can get into a whole episode about how you just need to like break out of those norms and put yourself in a different way. It's going to help you tons.
Mhm.
But yeah, no,
Mm.
those section drawings, game changer. I knew
Yeah.
more about that project very quickly.
I think I just realized this. I think that's when like my section brain just like completely turned on too. Was like
Mm,
I think everything in section because of it.
yeah,
I like I'm not necessarily a plan driven designer. I like to think in section most of the time. Like what does this experience look like? And
yeah,
so yeah, no, you just made you reminded me of that.
yeah. I appreciate that especially. I don't want to be plan driven. I see those little I see where like I can't let anything go in that sense. Like if something isn't gonna work well, I'm just gonna work. I need to work it until it works well. Like bathrooms.
Yeah.
Shoot, don't get me started about bathrooms. Like
Yeah.
yeah, it's not worth that. Especially like I've seen students or like my own peers just on the other side. They just plopped it somewhere and they just don't explain it in the presentation. Like you can get
Mhm.
away with it. No one's gonna look at your bathrooms later on. Now, when you get into your career, you should consider these things, but you don't have that time right now. You just put something in, you know.
Mhm.
But no, I think we can start to wrap up our like introductions of other processes and go into like our final year professors and like those last few little nuggets before we're graduated,
Mhm.
released into the world and
Hmm.
everything. And
Very
we'll start
theory
with your
driven.
guys's. Yeah, theory driven
Theory
or yeah,
driven.
theory driven
Hmm.
process. We should start with your guys's because your guys's is a
Oh,
an
dude.
interesting person.
I reject it completely at this point. I think it's I think maybe it's because I was just so over with the class, but I just completely just I blocked that out in my head now. How do you feel about it, Sully?
I think he had some. There's going to be some things he said to me that I'm going to keep. There's some isms that he had,
Oh
lab
yeah,
coat isms.
Professor Labcoat we're talking about.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Professor
Yeah,
Labcoat. Professor
Professor
Labcoat
Lapko
isms
is
that he had will stay with me forever because there's some aspects to what he was saying that were valid. The idea of
Mhm.
iteration, Like the idea of iteration, the idea of there's some research there, and the idea of thinking
Mhm.
about the person and how it interacts with the space. But
Mhm.
it's overall like, yeah, I don't know. I'm
I
not
drew okay,
big of a
so
fan.
all of this kind of ties itself or relates itself back to atmosphere and the research of
Hmm.
atmosphere.
Yes,
But what did you think about his like sayings of plan is choreography, section is body schema, elevation is composition, drawing is design? Like those were his foundational parts of what makes architecture architecture.
they're valid. I would say the section one is out there. Body schema. We could. Do I want to explain that? I don't know, really. The idea that body schema body schema is implying the idea of someone's actions and movements ultimately being interacting with the space itself, and you got to think about that in section. So choreography is how you travel through a plan. Like
Hmm.
you start at the entry where you're going next, the lobby where you're
Hmm.
going next. After that, you might be going to a meeting, so you're gonna where's the meeting at? Like you got to understand the
Hmm.
dance that someone's playing while interacting with a as a user in that space.
Hmm.
When you get into section, it's the idea of we don't have to get into this whole thing. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but
Yeah.
there's validity to what he was saying, but the words, I don't know. It does. Did it really need to be those words? Elevation, I
Yeah,
suck at. Composition,
dude,
that
but
was my
your
that was my
elevation was
best.
Crazy.
That was my best thing I did. That I
That
did.
was
I
that's
worked.
my favorite project of Soli's, straight up.
Yeah,
I want that framed in my house or my studio apartment.
I'm gonna sell
Literally.
that. I'm gonna sell that when I'm at rock bottom. We'll see what happens when I'm washed.
No, but how would you like summarize their perspective on theory and architecture adding to your process? Because I can get into that with my final fifth year professor after that.
Oh, dude. It's like, okay, the way that I understood the theory was that atmosphere, this all encompassing thing that we were talking about, atmosphere and architecture, is what drives people to become, like, what drives people and things to become architecture and being within and living in architecture, I guess. And so the mind body relationship, like, if your architecture forces your body to be constricted, your mind starts to think of what does it feel to be constricted? What does it like? Well, it makes you feel tiny. And so then it makes you like, there's like, if this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's like a
So
lot
being
of
a lot more aware of
correlation.
the experience of how you're all the moves you're making real time are impacting the experience and being aware of how that
Hmm.
experience is
Yeah.
experienced.
It's the idea. It
Hmm.
like you're kind of you're creating an object. You're objectifying. I guess that's the right word. But it's the idea of that feedback between you and your mind, body and mind, all that stuff,
Hmm.
with the environment around you. And so rather than just thinking of it as a feedback loop, it's taking that middle part and calling it a thing, and that thing is atmosphere,
Hmm.
which
There's two
Interesting.
sections,
Yeah.
yeah. The person, the mind, and the body, and then there's the architecture slash environment, and then what happens in between is the atmosphere,
yep.
Yeah.
the
No, I
interaction.
was going to say, because thinking more of like the theoretical sense of the process with my final professor, Professor Maze Runner, they, they they definitely likes to push on that theory aspect of architecture. Like I really respect this perspective, like now being able to look back on it as a semester as a whole type of situation instead of like being in the moment or whatever. I didn't quite catch it as quickly, but they were really into architecture being seen as like this art form, the ability that architects have to just manipulate space and creating simple to like, extravagant spatial experiences by doing architectural moves. Like some of the things, like we talked about this in the last podcast episode, but like with the Sauna Rolex Center, in the process in the studio projects themselves, we had did a lot of precedent research, very similar to Professor Hot Dog would do or whatever. But then we would push more on it instead of looking at it as like spatial experience. It would be more of like, so how did they get this experience by making a building component do what it does? And like with the Rolex Center,
Mhm.
it was the floor and the ceiling following the floor and how that changes your perspective on the space because you can't access it a certain way or because you had to go up a ramp that changes your perspective on how these two spaces in section are like literally right on top of each other, but because this architectural element exists here and does what it does, it now makes you experience this entire space differently. So we took a lot of those
Mhm.
components while we're thinking through our own process of the projects we're doing and doing different types of exploration, similar to Professor Hits Different with like sculptures and art pieces and everything, or like
Yeah.
study models, I guess you could say. And then
Mhm.
just seeing how different movements or like rotations of walls and whatever else can just like add on to that architectural and spatial experience of a
Mhm.
building.
Mhm.
And even more of what I liked about it too is this kind of coincided with the time where I was like really curious about Bjarke Ingels group projects where they combine typologies together to create something new. He really challenged us to think like, what else can a wall do? And that was like his whole seminar that was taken at the same time too. It was just
Mhm.
like challenging what a wall is. It's like these like rudimentary first year concepts that you just
Mhm.
absorb in and just go forth, and then revisiting that with a fifth year brain, and like,
Mhm.
yeah, what can a wall do? Can a wall become a floor? Why not? Like, what does that do? What does it do in the space if a wall becomes a floor or a floor becomes a wall? And how does that change their entire architectural thing? Another thing he really said is like the architectural thesis of your project. He would say that for everything. It didn't even matter that it was like our thesis year. It was just like, with this project, you now have an opportunity to impact the architectural industry. What is your architecture thesis in this project? I'm like, whoa, I honestly didn't even think about projects like that anymore. I kind of abandoned
Mhm.
that in second year and just got more on focus on like the user experience and emotions and stuff. Now it's like, yeah, I mean, you're right. We're about to be architects soon. Like we should kind of think about what we can do in our legacy a little bit to change the architecture industry, introduce some new concepts or whatever. So
Mhm.
overall, I think it was a really beneficial thing to have that kind of process introduction of how he did it. Even though I
Mhm.
was a little fighting it at the beginning because it did seem very function follows form type of
Mm.
mentality of like, let's create the sculpture first and we'll figure out how to fill it in with details later.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I had to try and use like some of my other experiences from other professors to supplement their process to get a project that I felt a lot more comfortable with through that process. But I
Mhm.
think yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of that whole thing.
Yeah.
But I guess
Yeah.
overall, you know, our takeaways. I think this would be a good component just for us to cleanly state like how we found our quote unquote unique style or like unique design process from taking all these snippets from everything. I
Um,
don't know if Albert, you want to
how
start?
did you start? How did
Yeah.
I kind
Yeah,
of
all
want
right.
Ryan to start.
Okay. So I think in general, right, I always start my process the same way with research. I think that's similar for all of us, but research
Mhm.
specifically has transformed over time from researching just the client and the user group to understanding the research of the community, what we can do in that community to help, you know, that community with our project that we're doing, thinking outside of just the architecture realm, what else can it service to its community, and trying to find like more of those emotional like hit points in our research to make that building even more meaningful to the people that we're making it for. The second part of that is then figuring out more of like taking that emotion piece as a concept and trying to develop that. I don't necessarily do like the art pieces necessarily anymore, where I'm actually modeling things or painting stuff, but I do sketch a lot, and that's
Mhm.
stuck with me from Professor Hot Dog Alive. Just drawing the vision that I see in my head, and if I can't quite visualize it, I do the precedent research and everything that I've gone from other
Mhm.
professors, and then being able to take that part and figure out more of like the Professor Hits Different perspective and the Professor Maze Runner perspective, like let's elevate this stuff to the next
Mhm.
level, figure out how does that become an actual building with that concept intact, and go into like your guys' thing of at every single level in the details and everything. And then at the very end, when you're kind of in that mid crit perspective, you developed your building quite a bit to that point.
Mhm.
Now taking like a zoomed out approach and being like, okay, let's go one step further. Let's see how we can introduce more ideas into this that can make it architecturally magnificent, like make it more significant
Mhm.
in an
Mhm.
architectural sense.
Mhm. Sully, what would your process look like now, based
Oh, you're
on
gonna be the
what you're?
final one. Okay.
I'll be the final one.
Okay. I would say I don't want to mimic a lot of what Ryan said because I feel like there's some validity to my design process in that standpoint. I
Mhm.
like to think about what does the what's this design calling for, I guess. So the research is going to be there, but the topic itself of that project, is it going to imply a more visual approach? Is it going to imply me unloading ideas? How there's a matter of synthesizing for me. So I always
Mhm.
maybe it's just there's some I like variety. So I'm always going to be finding
Variety is the
ways to
spice of life.
draw. It might be, yes, exactly, as a friend of ours once said a lot. But whether that is drawing, whether that's doing a more formal art, whether it's just writing it down because I need to put my ideas down somehow, those
Those
really,
three sentences.
those three sentences, yeah, another thing that I still keep to this day. It's that idea of how do I get it down to a concept? How do I take it to a
Mhm.
concept? And then from there, just run with it. Have to
Mhm.
iterate. You have to understand how, maybe work with your hands, understand how it's going to be built
Mhm.
that way. Something I want to get a lot better at. It's something I picked up pretty recently. The idea of you can, yeah, going digitally, modeling it, seeing how it looks, maybe not getting stuck on plans too much, stuff like that. But the idea ultimately is seeing how that continues and being consistent with what you started with. And
Mhm.
yeah, in order to do that, you have to gain some form of emotional attachment. So how you find
Mm.
that is that my how I'm feeling. So you gotta have emotional attachment to what you're designing. That ultimately helps you. I've
Mhm.
realized that helps you really gain a perspective and love for the building that you're doing, and that love shows in your craft.
So, what about you, Albert? What's your
Uh,
synopsis? What's your
I
takeaway?
guess okay. My thing is very much like Professor Hits different.
Mm-hmm.
I think with a mix of a lot of other professors, I kind of start with research, learning from, just that's just who I am. I can't start a project without ever looking at what made that place become that place, what made that building become that building, what made those people become those people. And so I have to do the research
Mm.
first and foremost, and then I start to create the art that I get from Professor Hits Different. I'm really going tying it back to like the emotional parts of what those baggages look like and how I can try to alleviate those through architecture. And then I start to think about what Professor Galaxy Brain says about like seeing things in ways that they weren't originally meant to be seen. Like
Mm.
turning things on its head.
Mm-hmm.
A diagram isn't just mass here, extrude here, cut here, shift here. Diagram is an architectural representation of the idea, of different way of seeing. And so, how can I start to think about the project in a way that is different but also ties back to the story itself. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can see from my process, I draw a lot of sections about like what does this experience look like. And so that also ties back to what Professor Hot Dog is saying is like you got to draw, draw, draw. And so I draw, draw, draw until most of it's just diagrammatic really, but it eventually becomes this like this building that was started from concept of art, then going back to the the project of its actualization. And so, and then from there, my process isn't really ended building ends there. My next process is okay, let's tie everything back to the story. We have to tie everything
Mm.
back and turn it into the presentation.
Yeah.
And everything that you've learned this semester has to go back to that. And so just last year, I had to go back into Professor Labcoat's teachings of the theories of atmosphere and affordances, like how can I tie those different things and become the presentation that it is now? And so that's where my process ends, the story. Now that you have all the drawings, all the things that makes the project, now how can I sell that project?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
my ending. Well, that about wraps everything up. Thank you guys for listening to this episode, and thank you to Sully for being a guest in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
We always love to have him back.
Yeah.
Yes,
He's the most
sir.
popular guest.
Yeah. I had a
Yes,
lot of
sir.
fun.
But yeah, before you guys leave, real quick, again, if you could check out our Instagram, if you're not following us there already, please do that, because we're really trying to build a community over there. Again, we're very active on there now. We're trying to get as much engagement as possible to figure out what you guys are having struggles with in studio, so we can talk about that in this season and other ones to come. So yeah, also, if you enjoyed this episode and some of these topics resonated you, you'll definitely want to check out our episode from last season where we expose our design process. It can help you find out what yours is too. A lot of similar talking points on that, so I would check it out.
See you guys, and see you in the next episode. And don't forget to save.
Don't forget to save.
Bye.